What's the deal with Seinfeld? Have you seen this show? You got the comedian guy, the anxious guy, the wacky guy, and the girl guy. That's too many guys. What are you trying to tell me, that these four personalities are both alike and different enough to bounce off each other for comedy? Get out of here, sister. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. You know what? That's quite enough of that. I'm not even doing an impression. I'm just riffing here. Let me just start over. Seinfeld debuted in 1989, ended in 1998, and in between produced 180 episodes. I watched Seinfeld in the 90s, and due to syndication, I watched Seinfeld well after the 90s. I recently rewatched the series from front to back. Seinfeld was something I never felt the urge to binge before, having previously seen it in its original run. But I did, and watching the series transform and grow over its 9 seasons, I have made several observations, enough to make Jerry Seinfeld himself proud. But first... So, how did Seinfeld get started? In 1988, NBC brought in Seinfeld for a meeting, but he had no experience in this sort of thing, so he brought in his friend Larry David. The series that we know today had several iterations during conversations and negotiations with NBC. According to Jennifer Tyson Armstrong, author of Seinfeldia, quote, Seinfeld was smart to consult David on this TV thing. David did have a vision, if not a particularly grand one. This, David said, as they bantered in Lee's Market, is what the show should be. Seinfeld was intrigued. At about midnight, they settled into a booth and riffed on the possibilities. What about a special that simply depicted where comics get their material? End quote. Seinfeld and David wrote what was supposed to be a 90-minute documentary special, but ended up only filling 30 minutes and feeling more like a sitcom. The series, then called The Seinfeld Chronicles, was not pitched as a show about nothing. It was pitched as a series about the life of a comedian and how he gets his material, from his real life. And because the real world Jerry Seinfeld is an observational comic, the series ended up picking apart the minutiae of everyday life. The cast was largely made up of people Larry David already knew. He met Julia Louis-Dreyfus when he worked on Saturday Night Live. He met Michael Richards when he worked on Fridays. And obviously, he and Seinfeld have been friends since the 70s. Many episodes of Seinfeld were based on real experiences. For example, George quitting his real estate job and then returning the next day was based on Larry David's time on SNL. According to the book Pretty Good by Josh Levine, quote, fed up with never getting anything on the show, Larry stormed in one day and told Ebersol that he was quitting, but almost immediately afterward he regretted the move. For one thing, he actually had a decent salary. For another, he had no other options. He moaned to his friend Kenny Kramer, who lived across the hall. Kramer told him to go in the next day and pretend it never happened, and that's just what Larry did. End quote. Watching the series again as an adult in my early 40s, it has mostly, aged well. It simply contains the sensibilities of a particular people living in a particular city at a particular time in American history, the 90s. Although pitched in 1988 and its pilot aired in 1989, Seinfeld feels culturally 90s in its social values, with all the complimentary and derogatory associations with that time period. Seinfeld, because of its everyday what-have-you focus, is one of the better time capsules for the 90s, a way for someone who wasn't there to see what people cared about and what people believed in that decade. What people believed about gender, sexuality, race, relationships, and less consequential matters like what people thought was funny. Seinfeld was such an enormous hit, at least by its 4th season, and studying what was popular might tell us a lot about culture than what is critically acclaimed, although Seinfeld was that too. Bear in mind that when I talk about serious matters in this video and how Seinfeld handled these matters, it will be done as a bit of anthropology. I'm not trying to cancel Seinfeld because it doesn't meet up to modern standards of social values. I rewatched the series recently, saw it through new eyes and a new perspective, and I have a lot to say. Whether or not what I say is meaningful is up to you, but it is definitely a lot. I mean, look at this runtime. Are the main characters from Seinfeld good people? Are they kind, good-hearted individuals who speak out against injustice? Are they honest and forthright? Are they more passive and unassuming than anything, a kind of Dungeons & Dragons true neutral alignment? Are they, as Babu would claim, very bad and not even people at all?
They're not human. They're very bad. Very, very, very bad.
I aim to explore this, and spoilers here, I don't have a great answer because these are fictional characters and this is a YouTube video, but it might be fun, so let's do it anyway. George Costanza is a neurotic, insecure, obsessive man with a short fuse and little in the way of bravery. George thinks little of himself, often blaming his lack of success, both financially and socially, on being short, stocky, bald, and slow-witted. I disagree with that assessment. In terms of his appearance, he's not classically handsome, but I suspect George with a full beard, leather jacket, and black t-shirt would be aesthetically pleasing in a masculine, stout, welterweight sort of way. George is funny, owing to his offbeat charm, and seems to have no problem meeting women. I have not done the calculations myself, but others who have done the work report that George has more girlfriends than Jerry throughout the series. In terms of his intelligence, George is more educated than most. George graduated Queens College, the real-life alma mater of Jerry Seinfeld. Only 37% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. That doesn't mean he's smarter than most people, it just means that he was in a position of privilege and took advantage of that privilege by getting an education. He was bright enough to be a pretty successful guy for a while. He was doing fine. All things considered, he did okay. The worst you can say about George's wisdom and intelligence is that he is mediocre, average. He clearly has some talents. Arguably, George's failures in life revolve around his insecurity, which he masks through uncanny, far-reaching duplicity. George is a liar. He does not dispute this, often referring to his ability to lie as an art. George's friends don't dispute this either. George feels justified in lying, because he's not lying to get ahead, he's lying to keep his head above water.
George, you're not really handicapped, are you?
I've had my difficulties.
George feels put upon because of his upbringing. His parents treated him so poorly that his confidence was shattered. He was bullied in school, sometimes even by the faculty. George does not see his dishonesty as some deep moral failing, but rather self-defense against a world that turned on him at a young age and never stopped. George is not some bad seed, as Elaine claims. He is simply struggling to make his way through life and not doing a particularly good job of it. Of course, an explanation is not an excuse, and none of this really justifies his cowardly acts throughout the series. For example, in one episode, George panics and pushes people over during an emergency. Let's be a little kind to George, though, because he does have his own moments of kindness. He cares about the security guard and buys him a chair. He correctly tells a mother to stop abusing her son. He says God bless you when a woman sneezes. Unfortunately, every time George tries to do the right thing, it blows up in his face. The security guard ends up falling asleep in the chair during a robbery. The son is not grateful for George's interference and openly mocks him. Even a simple God bless you ends up in disaster for the woman and her husband, as they contemplate divorce immediately thereafter. No wonder George rarely does the right thing. It always backfires. George is sometimes blamed for his fiancée Susan's death, both by audiences and characters within the series. George picks out wedding invitations, Susan licks the envelopes, and accidentally poisons herself. In the next season, George starts to believe that people on the board of the Susan Ross Foundation suspect him of murdering Susan. In a later episode, George discovers that Susan's parents do, in fact, blame him for the death of their daughter. This is also brought up in the series finale. We, as the audience, know George did not intentionally buy poisonous envelopes, but some viewers might still consider it negligent because he chose those envelopes specifically because they were inexpensive. The accusation is that George's consistent cheapness indirectly resulted in Susan's demise. 2 points about that. First, inexpensive is not the same as lethal. If we buy inexpensive goods with no cause to believe that these goods are dangerous and these goods end up poisoning us to death, then it is the creators of these goods who are negligent, not us. Second, although the clerk warned George and Susan that the glue was not especially adhesive and would require a lot of moisture, they were not warned that the glue was dangerous. I watched this scene over and over again, and the clerk did not indicate that the glue was toxic, poisonous, or dangerous in any way. In fact, by saying the word moisture here, it was the clerk who more or less recommended that the envelopes should be licked. George, however, did not tell Susan to lick the envelopes. Instead, he recommended buying new glue. Someone needs to fix the Villains Wiki because it incorrectly states that George was warned that the invitations were toxic. That did not happen. Stop lying. To be clear, I'm not blaming Susan for her own death. I'm also not really blaming the clerk, even though her recommendation was what Susan followed and what ultimately led to Susan's demise. No. I'm blaming the manufacturers of the glue and envelopes. George cannot be responsible for Susan's death just because he picked out the invitations because A, as a consumer, he had a reasonable expectation that he would not be purchasing something lethal, and B, he explicitly gave Susan instructions that would have saved her life. I find George Louis Costanza not guilty in the death of Susan Ross. Let's talk about Elaine. Born in my old stomping grounds of Balmore and Towson, Elaine Bennis works for Pendant Publishing in Manhattan. She's smart, successful, and in the early seasons, really too good to be hanging out with George, Kramer, and Jerry all the time. This comes to a head in a later season episode in which she finds more reputable, reliable versions of her friends. As the seasons went on, Elaine became a lot more like her friends, kidnapping a dog, destroying a business because she wasn't allowed to eat soup there, and other questionable actions. Oh, and those friend doppelgangers? In the end, they reject Elaine, because by that point in the series, she's in a limbo between being too much of a big shot for her friends, but too much like her friends to hang out with decent, caring people. Early seasons Elaine had principles. She had a lot to say when she saw a woman wearing fur. Later seasons Elaine just doesn't have time for that.
And of course, you find fur morally reprehensible.
Anti-fur. Who has the energy anymore?
As explained by Paul Arras in Seinfeld, A Cultural History, quote, Elaine is the embodiment of the crisis of the yuppie. Riding the rising New York City economy to a comfortable career in the publishing industry, Elaine has a sense of entitlement that comes from her self-confidence. She believes she deserves the success in life and love that is coming to her. Yet when she stumbles in those categories, she is reminded of a nagging sense that somewhere, somehow, she took a wrong turn. Unquote. Jerry Seinfeld, the character, not the actor, is a morally neutral bystander of life. He plays the comparatively reasonable straight man witnessing the antics of Kramer, the lies of George, and the failures of Elaine. He often chooses not to intervene, and instead makes a smug, sarcastic remark about how their plans are foolish, and that their attempts to better their lives are meaningless. By Jerry's own admission, he is not a man of any depth.
I'm open. There's just nothing in there.
When one of his girlfriends wants him to open up more, he says that there is nothing inside. He briefly learns to express himself more, but is scared straight by George opening up to him. Jerry enjoys the applause, but he does not enjoy the people doing the clapping. There are moments, especially in the earlier seasons, in which Jerry shows himself to be vulnerable or caring, but these become fewer and fewer still as the series continues. Jerry has a childlike innocence, but also can't grow up enough to take responsibility for himself. He intentionally gets his girlfriend drunk so that he can play with her vintage toys. He steals a marble rye like a child grabbing a candy bar, and reads more cereal boxes than books. Jerry invents reasons to break up with women because he doesn't want anyone to get close. Jerry is an empty husk of a man who cares about the social graces only because of his fastidiousness and his desire for his own comfort. Cosmo Kramer is a fun-loving hipster doofus. At a glance, his primary concerns appear to be his base pleasures and aesthetics. He loves women, fashion, and spectacle. He tomcats around Manhattan, enjoying the company of women but rarely committing to anything resembling a relationship. But does that make him a bad person? Isn't Kramer just sex positive? If he mistreated these women or led them on that the relationship might be heading towards marriage, that might be dishonest. But Kramer's dalliances and cavorting are entirely healthy and consensual. Frankly, Kramer treats women better than George treats women, even better than Jerry treats women. He's open about his desires, and that's just it. No pretense. There are moments of perversion, such as when he leers at a naked woman who may be unaware that she can be seen by her neighbors. That is not cool. However, if we are judging Kramer, we must similarly judge Jerry and George, who also engage in some tompeepery. Kramer is no worse than Jerry and George with regards to women. He may even be better. He just has a grander sexual appetite than both of them combined. Kramer can fall in love, though. He is blissfully in love with Pam, Jerry's girlfriend, and he is serious enough about Anna to meet her entire family, with admittedly disastrous results. Kramer's endless stream of women is a red flag for a woman who wants something serious, but there are no red flags about Kramer's actual mishandling of women. Kramer is a harmless weirdo, an enormous goofball who doesn't mean any real harm. In fact, outside of accidental mishaps due to his harebrained, money-making schemes, Kramer seems like a decent, affable man. He greatly cares about his friends and is only dishonest with them in the baseline sitcom sense. A sitcom requires conflicts between the characters, but Kramer is never depicted as being more dishonest than the others. He is probably the most honest. He is one of the only characters seen racked with guilt over his pangs of conscience and often makes moralistic statements.
And let's face it, without rules, there's chaos.
Kramer's adherence to the law is inconsistent. In some episodes, he is shown to be a stickler for the rules, and in other episodes, he is shown flouting the law. When he does try to get around the law, it's never in a way that would hurt the common man. Only major corporations and institutions, such as when he convinces Jerry to pirate cable or commit mail fraud against the United States Postal Service. Kramer is a friend to the worker, going on strike, correctly calling people scabs for their scabbery, and becoming a communist at least for one episode. Kramer changes the least out of the main characters in Seinfeld. Jerry, George, and Elaine become colder and less likable, whereas Kramer is always just Kramer. I don't know if I'm capable of determining the weight of fictional characters' souls, but I will say that if these people were real, I would only hang out with Kramer. He seems like a mostly good guy who cares about his neighbors. He's more of a rogue with a heart of gold than a straight-up bad person. There is that one scene that suggests that he might snitch on me if I committed a crime, but we never really see him cooperate with the authorities. So he gets a pass on that. I'm calling it Cosmo Kramer, the only good Seinfeld character in the main quartet. Observational humor is a form of comedy in which the comedian comments on everyday concerns and affairs. An observational comedian broaches a common topic, then he interrogates our everyday practices related to the topic. Observational humor relies on the comedian having made a solid observation about something ordinary that, when interrogated, appears strange or foolish. Most observational humor bits told by Jerry Seinfeld actually rely on the audience not thinking about his humorous observations for too long and generally fall apart with greater context. Sure, they're just jokes, I get it, but some of these jokes could be heckled. Let's look at an example on Seinfeld.
Women put on their perfume in an interesting way. I love watching them, their little key stratego, little areas and places they think we're going.
In the case of Jerry assuming that women are spraying perfume exclusively to attract men and placing their perfume in the wrong places, women are actually applying their perfume to pulse points on their bodies. I'm not a scientist, but according to L'Oreal, these points emit more heat than normal, and heat activates the perfume and the scent reaches its full potential. Women are just reading the instructions, Jerry.
I tell you, I never really understood the importance of the conductor. What the hell is this guy doing?
Jerry, the conductor, is communicating with the musicians through a series of motions and gestures. I'm not a musician, just like I'm not a scientist, but it's partly about timing and volume and stuff like that. I thought that was pretty obvious, even to a layman.
The only reason that you're getting in shape is that so you can get through the workout.
What are you talking about, dude? People get in shape to lose weight, to feel better about themselves, to stay healthy, to compete in athletics, to correct something that their doctor recommended correcting, etc. I'm sorry if any of this makes me appear humorless, but some of these observations suck. To show I'm a good sport, here are some of my observations related to topics brought up on Seinfeld. You ever notice how police officers are dangerous and out of control in the real world, but in Seinfeld they're just laughably incompetent? And you know, that is often true in the real world as well. I mean, it's not one or the other, but on Seinfeld the cops are just bad at their jobs in a less egregious way. I do applaud Seinfeld for consistently portraying the police as total clowns. In the first season episode, The Robbery, Jerry's apartment is robbed because Kramer forgot to close the door. When Jerry informs the humorless, uninterested police officer of what happened, he asks if the police ever solve these cases.
Well, Mr. Seinfeld, we'll look into it and we'll let you know if we find anything.
You ever find anything?
No.
In the season 4 episode, The Ticket, Jerry and George are hiding from Joe Davola, a violent stalker. They want to leave, so they ask the police officer to escort them outside, which would take all of 10 seconds. The police officer spends a half an hour ordering food and ignoring 2 people in need. In the end, the police officer does not help them at all. In the Season 8 episode, The Summer of George, Elaine finds herself in a dangerous conflict with a woman named Sam. When she asks the police for help, they fetishize the conflict as a catfight. So do all the other men in the episode, but these are the guys who are supposed to be protecting and serving. The police are similarly useless in the Puerto Rican Day Parade, suspicious and unsympathetic in The Beard, and aggressive and self-righteous in The Library. In the Season 3 episode, The Parking Space, George attempts to parallel park near Jerry's building, and someone else, Mike Moffat, rushes in headfirst to take the spot for himself. They can't agree on who should have the spot. When two police officers arrive, rather than simply making a decision, they argue between themselves and nothing gets done. For the record, it's George's spot. I'm sorry, but this is not that complicated. George was there first. Admittedly, because George took a few extra seconds to prepare, Mike might have thought that George was not parking. But once it became clear that George was parking during the near collision, Mike should have said, sorry, and went on his merry way. Mike is trying to muddy the issue by introducing two arguments. Mike claims to, I'm sorry, this is very important to me. Mike claims to have been confused about whether or not George was parking because he was taking a while. Mike also claims that parking headfirst is acceptable under certain circumstances. But here's the thing. Even if Mike's intentions were completely honorable, did not mean any disrespect, and was not trying to steal George's spot, as he claims, that is not the issue. The code of ethics related to parking spots is almost exclusively who was there first. George. George Louis Costanza. That's who. If I accidentally walk into the wrong apartment, the tenant might choose not to press charges for trespassing due to this being an honest mistake, but that doesn't mean that I get to stay there and claim that it's my apartment now. We don't have to condemn Mike for making what might have been an honest mistake, but we don't give him the parking spot. I've lived in big cities most of my life: Baltimore, Las Vegas, Austin, Baltimore again, Philadelphia, and some other places in between. And Mike does not have a real argument. He has excuses about why he parked front first, but not an argument about being there first. I don't know what New York City law says about it, but people generally understand this is part of the social contract. Also, Mike Moffat is a big phony. Here's another observation. You ever notice how Seinfeld co-creator Larry David does a number of cameos throughout the series? What's the deal with that? Okay, so playing Spot Larry David is a fun meta game to play while rewatching Seinfeld. In this scene from the Chinese restaurant, David's voice can clearly be heard after Elaine makes a public spectacle of herself. In the episode The Heart Attack, Jerry watches a science fiction film called The Flaming Globes of Sigmund, starring none other than Larry David as a German sci-fi weirdo. In this episode, Larry David's voice can be heard as none other than Newman. Yes, the co-creator of Seinfeld was actually the original Newman before the writers decided to give the, until that point, unseen character an actual role on the series. It went to Wayne Knight. In the second part of The Trip, Larry David is right there in the corner of the screen gawking at Kramer, who is about to be falsely arrested under suspicion of being a serial killer. In the episode The Pilot, Larry David plays a member of Greenpeace. In The Chinese Woman, he plays my favorite cameo of them all, the man in the cape. In The Gum, he plays a cashier. It's a particularly funny cameo to me because Jason Alexander played George Costanza essentially doing a Larry David impersonation. And finally, most famously, Larry David played the voice of Yankees owner George Steinbrenner. What's the deal with the episode The Jimmy? Content warning, essay. So, in The Jimmy, Jerry goes to the dentist. And when he wakes up, he sees Tim Whatley and a woman seemingly dressing themselves as if they were undressed moments before. Jerry is deeply concerned that he was sexually abused while he was unconscious. This is played for laughs, and I do not want to talk about that fact right now. What I do want to talk about is the question of whether Jerry's shirt was tucked or untucked before he was unconscious. Jerry's evidence that he was abused is that his shirt was untucked after he regained consciousness. Jerry and Elaine debate whether or not he commonly tucks those shirts. Well, let's look at the evidence ourselves. Here's Jerry wearing the shirt earlier that day, untucked. Here's Jerry wearing the shirt untucked again before he goes under the gas. At least I think it's untucked. Jerry's other piece of evidence is that a Penthouse magazine has a story about something sexual happening while a patient was under anesthesia. But as Jerry himself is off to point out, these letters are fake. Even if they were real, there is no reason to believe that out of all the doctors in the world, his dentist is also the one who wrote this letter. Also, the time between Jerry's experience and reading the Penthouse magazine is, what, a few days, a week? Do you know how long magazines take to get put together? The contents of this Penthouse were finalized long before Jerry went to the dentist. It definitely cannot be about him. It's impossible. I hereby declare that Jerry Seinfeld was not abused while he was unconscious at the dentist. This is pretty heavy stuff, so let's change tones immediately. There are a lot of good jokes in Seinfeld, but rather than show you my favorite jokes and my favorite lines, I want to show you my favorite line reads. My favorite odd, exaggerated performances.
Charlie here. He's a man. You know who else? Me. I'm a man.
I'm a man.
You should always bring a pad and a pen.
I can't carry a pen. I'm afraid I'll puncture my scrotum.
Can I have a sip?
No.
You thought you could waltz for the rest of your life and never bump into me again, but you were wrong, Jerry. You were wrong.
Hey, Willie, check it out. Free candy.
You're killing Independent George!
In every generation, there exists an enormous amount of people who believe that the population has suddenly and unexpectedly become far too sensitive. To right this terrible wrong and guarantee that this does not continue into the future or get worse in the future, all this sensitivity simply must stop immediately. If it doesn't, then a more drastic step must be taken. Turn back the clock altogether to a more insensitive time. This is also the position of social conservatism and reactionary right-wing politics. Woke is the catch-all term of today, but in the time of Seinfeld, the term politically correct was much more common. That term is still sometimes said today, but it has lost a lot of its luster and usage. Seinfeld was inoffensive enough to be on primetime network television in the 90s, but in many instances, certainly politically incorrect. Seinfeld's politics can be summed up in this scene, in which Jerry is offended that someone else is offended by his insensitive remarks.
I mean, aren't we all getting a little too sensitive? I mean, somebody asked me which way is Israel. I don't fly off the handle.
Really? You wouldn't? Because if I were a Jewish man in the 90s walking down the sidewalk in New York and a stranger looked me up and down and said, "Hey, which way to Israel?" I would assume he wasn't actually asking which subway connection gets me to the Middle East. I would assume that he was making an anti-Semitic remark. One that does not contain an explicit insult, but is clearly designed to be reductive. Saying things like, "which way to whatever stereotype I know about you," or "go back to place of ancestral origin," is how people in the majority remind people in the minority about their place on the de facto social hierarchy. Jerry and his friends commit a series of insensitive actions, but only by accident. For two reasons. First, it reinforces the idea that everyone is too sensitive and that any offense is almost certainly caused by a misunderstanding. Second, it protects the main characters from being unlikable, overtly racist, ableist, or anti-Semitic. Allow me to counter-argue what I expect will be a common dissent about this viewpoint. Jerry, George, Elaine, and Kramer are sometimes portrayed as clueless about racial politics and the plights of people different from themselves. That might produce the argument that the main characters are portrayed as wrong, much like in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Okay, that's almost a good argument until you rewatch the series front to back like I did. The consistent way that the series deals with political correctness, showing insensitive remarks and actions to be misunderstandings 99% of the time, always from the perspective of white people, always portraying white people as mostly harmless perpetrators, always portraying minorities as overly sensitive, often but not always portraying minorities as caricatures, or engaging in stereotypes. Well, it's challenging to see the racial politics in this almost exclusively white television series as anything more than white television writers seeing what they could get away with. I was curious and looked up each writer of each episode, and it's whites all the way down. Now, you could argue that the writers are lampooning white people here and there, but it comes across less condemnation and more roast. A roast lovingly mocks its subjects, and only criticizes in such a way that the subjects will be amused more than upset, or made to be introspective. In one episode, Jerry presents Elaine with a gift, a cigar store Native American statue. Jerry makes a few goofy comments about Native American stereotypes, and one of Elaine's friends, Winona, abruptly leaves the apartment. Winona, as it turns out, is Native American herself. Jerry eventually apologizes, but the implication is that it was only wrong for him to do this because she was in the room, not because it was wrong in and of itself. Winona just misunderstood Jerry, who was only trying to be funny. Later, Jerry asks a mailman for directions to a Chinese restaurant because mailmen know the area. On closer inspection, the mailman himself is Chinese. Because he has been reduced to his ethnicity in this way, and because he has probably been treated like an outsider many times before, he lashes out. But Jerry didn't mean any offense. It was all a misunderstanding. Jerry learns nothing by the end of the episode. In a later episode, George wants to suck up to his boss and tells him that he looks like Sugar Ray Leonard. His boss, played by Tuvix himself, does not really all that closely resemble one of history's most famous boxers, prompting him to say,
"I suppose we all look alike to you, right, Costanza?"
No matter where you as the audience stand, this is portrayed only as a misunderstanding, because it needs to be that way in order for George to still be likable. George learns nothing. In another episode, when Kramer dates a black woman, he accidentally offends her family. Kramer mistakenly spent too much time in a tanning bed, and when he meets her family, he looks like he's doing blackface, and Kramer learns nothing. This goes beyond casual racism and sometimes veers into ableism. For example, in one episode, Jerry's leg keeps falling asleep. Because of this, he accidentally gives a disabled man the mistaken impression that Jerry was mocking him.
The guy has one leg and he still calls himself Leapin' Larry. You'd think he'd have a sense of humor about it.
Again, this was only a misunderstanding and Jerry learns nothing. There are very few recurring characters played by people of color on Seinfeld. Bob, who appears in 3 episodes, is Hispanic. He is a criminal who steals furniture but also has a social conscience, so it's kind of a wash. A man named Sid shows up here and there in the early seasons, but we know almost nothing about him except for his occupation. He parks cars. There is George's boss in a few episodes, but the only black character of any note in the series is Jackie Chiles. To give Seinfeld credit, there are times in which deeply racist attitudes are condemned, but only the racism that casual racists think is too far. The most obvious example is when Jerry and George are mistaken for Nazis. The episode is pretty clearly anti-Nazi, so, there is that, but really that's about it. It's important to recognize that the main character's learning nothing about sensitivity is not simply an extension of the philosophy of the show, often described as no hugging, no learning. It is far more an extension of politically incorrect politics of the 90s, and the explicitly stated politics of the series. It's not only the characters who learn nothing, it's the audience. Now, to reiterate, I'm not canceling Seinfeld. I don't have that authority, and I wouldn't want it to begin with. I'm not even saying that Seinfeld is an inherently racist television series because of any of this, but it's, hard not to notice, right? How much it ruins your day, well, your mileage may vary, but it's in there, all over the place, and it's impossible to ignore. It would also be intellectually dishonest to ignore. Before we can address how sexual orientation was portrayed in Seinfeld, we need to understand the time and place that Seinfeld inhabited. While Seinfeld is widely remembered as a seminal 90s show, Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David pitched the series to NBC in a meeting in 1988, and the pilot episode debuted in 1989. In 1988, nobody except hobbyists and scientists had heard of the internet, phones were just phones, video games were exclusively the domain of children. The Cold War, which arguably began in 1945, still had a couple years left. Goods, services, and homes were relatively affordable, but wouldn't be for long because of the aftershocks of Reaganomics and neoliberalism, and nobody knew a gosh darn thing about anything unless it was in the local news or public schools. I was born in 1982. That was only a few decades ago, but it feels prehistoric. The world today looks similar to how it did in my childhood. The same schools, convenience stores, and roads still exist, but the way everything functions and the things that we believe are unrecognizable to someone in 1982. We are socialized to believe whatever the people in our immediate circle of friends and family believe. Now, put yourself in the mind of someone living before our modern everyday circumstance, a grown adult in the United States in 1989 with a basic public school education and not intellectually curious enough to take a lot of sociology and humanities classes at university, having experienced the world through the carefully curated local news media and corporate advertising. If the mind of this person, this you, is a heterosexual, do you think that you probably have highly informed, deeply sensitive, and perfectly welcoming attitudes about the gay community and have a host of gay friends? Maybe. You never know, but probably not. Misinformation and generational ignorance were, and in many cases still are, enormous roadblocks to gay liberation. But there existed, and still exist, institutional roadblocks as well. In the United States, homosexuality was only removed as a mental illness in 1974. So-called sodomy laws began to be overturned state by state, but many states refused. In 1986, in the case of Bowers v. Hardwick, the Supreme Court held the constitutionality of laws that legally marginalized gay couples. The opinion was not reversed until 2003 in the case of Lawrence v. Texas, although by that point, the laws were only selectively enforced. For context, Seinfeld debuted in 1989, 3 years after Bowers v. Hardwick, and ended in 1998, 5 years before Lawrence v. Texas. Seinfeld begins in 1989, in which President George H.W. Bush continued the work of Ronald Reagan by largely ignoring the AIDS crisis and showing little, if any, sympathy. I say all of this not to make things too heavy, but to explain the context for the world in which Seinfeld inhabited. As we sort through the homophobia in Seinfeld, bear in mind that this is not meant to condemn a television series. Like I said, this is anthropological and archaeological, not strictly moralistic or high-horsed. Homophobia takes its most literal form in George Costanza. George is terrified of either being secretly gay or being perceived as gay. From what we actually see, this does not come from any particular incident or trauma. George is simply perceived as a paranoid neurotic, and that his homophobia is simply inexplicable and somehow a non-judgmental byproduct of his paranoia more generally. George is enormously and comically homophobic. His casual admission that he is homophobic does suggest that he is not ashamed of being homophobic the way one might be ashamed in the 21st century.
I think you're afraid to sit next to a man. You're a little homophobic, aren't you?
Is it that obvious?
If, in 2024, I noticed that I displayed homophobic characteristics or treated gay people less than the way I treated straight people, I would be ashamed. He is not perceived by the 90s audience as contemptible because of his homophobia. Instead, George is the object of mockery. Although in a more unintentionally insidious way, George is also the object of sympathy for his homophobia. George personified the generalized, unexamined homophobia of the early 90s, but in a way that sympathized with the homophobic, not the victims of homophobia. Jerry is also homophobic, but he displays his homophobia in a more subdued manner, as if his homophobia is the correct way to be homophobic.
Do you think it's effeminate for a man to put clothes in a gentle cycle? I don't know, just standing there with a box, holding it by the little string.
You think it's effeminate?
It's a tad dainty. I mean, neither one of us.
No.
So,
Exactly.
I'm not gay.
Neither am I.
Fans of the series might object to Jerry being characterized as homophobic, partly because that's George's whole thing, and partly because they might not want to acknowledge that Jerry's attitude counts as homophobic, designating homophobia only in its most literal sense or only as an overtly pointed and hateful attitude. Homophobia is not only literal fear of being perceived as gay or overt, violent hatred. Homophobia is also a system of institutionalized discrimination and misinformation that characterizes LGBTQ+ people as inherently more dangerous and sexualized than heterosexual people. It is actually Jerry who repeats the most common 80s and 90s homophobic misinformation about gay people, such as recruitment.
When they approach a new recruit, I'm sure that's one of the big selling points.
Recruitment is a fabricated, fictional practice in which gay people increase their numbers by essentially hard-selling straight people into becoming gay. In this homophobic nightmare fantasy, straight people are the targets of a kind of gay hypnosis or confidence game. In addition to this fictional practice labeling homosexuality as a choice instead of an orientation, it also casts gay people as predatory, and casts straight men as the victims of an encroaching homosexual threat. Jerry, both the character and the actor, probably did not perceive this line as homophobic, because it begins with a patronizing line about homosexuality having the benefit of matching wardrobes. This joke, in and of itself, is mostly harmless, but what came after, the recruitment lie, was not. This particular lie was antiquated in May of 1994 when the episode aired. It sounds like a bit that Jerry Seinfeld, the actor-comedian, wrote in the 1980s and just never got to use until now. In the episode The Note, Jerry consoles George's homophobia with his own brand of misinformation, telling George that if a man touches him under any circumstances and his body reacts favorably, this is the test that would conclude that a man is gay. Now, one might argue that the audience is not meant to take Jerry and George seriously here, but there is no counter to this. Nobody steps in and gives an alternative to this misinformation. At the risk of being vulgar, a penis can become erect under almost any circumstances. Warm water can make a penis erect. George's experience with the massage is unremarkable. Much later in the series, in the episode The Engagement, George tells Jerry about how much he misses Susan Ross, his ex-girlfriend. Jerry reminds George that she is a lesbian, but George says it didn't take. This reinforces a number of nasty pieces of misinformation about the LGBTQ+ community. For one, it reinforces the outdated notion that homosexuality is often just a phase. Bear in mind that this episode aired in September 1995, not 10 years prior. But this misunderstanding was still widely prevalent in the 90s. Seinfeld was still living in a pre-Will and Grace world. For another, it erases bisexuality completely. Isn't Susan just, bisexual or pansexual or literally anything besides gay or straight? She dates men, she dates women. You might be thinking, this is ridiculous. Why is this so complicated for the writers of Seinfeld? Did people just not acknowledge bisexuality in 1995? Well, yeah, kind of. This is a magazine cover introducing the concept of bisexuality to the American population as the emerging sexual orientation, like it's a new model car that's just been invented. It's from 1995, the same year as this episode of Seinfeld. I remember this being a topic on my Twitter feed recently because of Chasing Amy. There are a lot of examples of this. Refusal to acknowledge bisexuality is called bisexual erasure, which itself is part of broader biphobia, or skepticism and mistreatment of bisexuality and bisexuals. This must be galling for bisexual and pansexual people because there is a growing body of research suggesting that attraction to more than one gender may be more common than previously hypothesized. According to Pew Research, quote, among adults who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, 62% identify as bisexual, while 38% are gay or lesbian, according to the same 2022 survey, unquote. Susan, from the perspective of most objective observers, is some shade of bisexual, pansexual, or a sexual orientation in which attraction to more than one gender exists. But the series itself never acknowledges this. Instead, her relationships with women are treated as aberrations, as flings, as phases, until she reaches her true sexuality. Susan is not written as a bisexual woman currently in a relationship with a man. Instead, Susan is written as a kind of failed lesbian who is actually heterosexual all along. In the episode The Cheever Letters, Susan discovers that her father, Henry, had an affair with a man. In the later episode The Virgin, Elaine remarks,
since she met him, she's been vomited on, her family cabin's been burned down, she learned her father's a homosexual, and she got fired from a high-paying network job.
Even ignoring the fact that the existence of a gay person is on a list of unfortunate incidents, there is no reference here or throughout the series about Henry being bisexual. The man that the fictional Henry Ross loved was real-life short story writer and novelist John Cheever. Cheever had relationships with both men and women and is widely understood as bisexual. Henry Ross also had relationships with both men and women, but he is only called homosexual by Elaine, and then he is shown to be in a committed marriage with his wife throughout the series with no further references to his sexuality or his feelings for John Cheever. Bisexual people have always existed, but a 90s audience was still grappling with this completely uncomplicated fact. In most episodes, Kramer is portrayed as being comfortable with his sexuality, and comfortable talking about men being attractive without fear of being mistaken for gay. But it is always done for comedic effect, not for social commentary.
No, Ann and I were just discussing whether or not I could admit a man is attractive.
Oh, I'll tell you who's an attractive man. George Will.
Kramer is comfortable enough with his sexuality that he kisses Jerry, but again, it's just played up as Kramer being goofy. In the episode The Subway, Elaine is uncomfortable telling a socially conservative woman that she is attending a wedding between two women. In the 90s, gay weddings in the United States were not legally binding, but they existed nonetheless. When the woman is repulsed by this admission, Elaine's primary concern is being mistaken for a lesbian.
I hate men,
but I'm not a lesbian.
Elaine reinforces homophobic misinformation by engaging with the make-believe notion that women become lesbians because they simply hate men, or that hating men is in some way connected to homosexuality in women. It's not too difficult to see the misogyny inherent in this mistaken belief. Even within a sexual arrangement that exclusively involves women, men still wish to center themselves in this conversation. People who are left-handed don't hate right hands. They're just left-handed. Jerry Seinfeld, the actor, not the character, had a persistent rumor follow him around since the 1970s that he was a closeted gay man. According to Jerry Oppenheimer, author of Seinfeld, The Making of an American Icon, Seinfeld was suspected to be gay in high school because he was part of a theater club with gay members. Quote, already viewed by classmates as a nerd, he now feared he might be labeled a queer like some other club members. In the early 1970s, conservative provincial Massapequa High had not yet come to terms with gay liberation. Years later, when Jerry became a big name himself, he became the subject of gossip among friends, and within the entertainment industry, that he was either gay or bisexual. Privately, Jerry was concerned about the talk, and efforts were made by his people to make him appear more macho, unquote. A writer for Seinfeld used this rumor as the basis for the famous episode The Outing, in which Jerry and George are incorrectly identified as gay. The episode goes out of its way, comically so, to let the audience know that there is nothing wrong with being gay. Once again, as explained in Seinfeldia, quote, David and Seinfeld almost abandoned an earlier version of Larry Charles's script for the episode due to fears of offending the gay community. But during the discussion, Charles uttered what would become one of the show's stickiest catchphrases, not that there's anything wrong with that, unquote. According to Jerry Seinfeld himself, the only way to, as he put it, get away with such panicked homophobic reactions on television in the mid-90s would be to pepper in this phrase throughout the episode. Whether you consider this a landmark moment for LGBTQ+ representation on television, or a bunch of straight people trying to get away with an episode about homophobia and finally quash a rumor depends on how charitably you watch The Outing. Many people think of it as a net good. Matt Baum made a YouTube video about The Outing, and he has his own take on the episode. If you want to go more in-depth on it, and from the perspective of a gay man, you might want to check that out. When you ask Seinfeld fans about the best seasons of the series, they generally rank seasons 1 and 2 as the worst, season 3 somewhere in the middle, and the later seasons, 4 through 9, scattered among the rest. Seasons 4 and 7 are usually ranked either at the top or near the top. Here's a hot take. I prefer seasons 1, 2, and to a lesser extent 3 over what came after. Before anyone rushes to the comments to accuse me of having a contrarian opinion to drive engagement, I am putting this at the end of the video, not the beginning, and I am prepared to defend my tastes. Here we go. The first 2 seasons of Seinfeld have a more down-to-earth, lived-in quality. Look at the lighting in Jerry's apartment in season 1. Jerry's apartment looks like, an apartment. It's an adult man's apartment. Baseball memorabilia, clean without being too tidy. The sofa looks fluffy, almost too fluffy, like it's not stable or new. The apartment in the pilot is different from the apartment in the rest of season 1. Now there's a stereo and a little computer, but it doesn't feel too staged. Clear cabinets in the kitchen to give the scene some more color, but it still looks real enough. In later seasons, I can't stop looking at the Superman statue and the rows of cereal. Like a lot of millennial men, I never entirely grew out of my childhood interests either. But this is a 30-something-year-old man in 1990. It makes him quirky, full of quirk, steeped in quirkness. It is the home of a sitcom character, not a man. Of course, he is a sitcom character, but that's the whole point. In the first 2 seasons, Jerry seems developed enough to draw in viewers, but real enough to be relatable. In the first 2 seasons, we get the sense that Jerry has everyday struggles and that he's still trying to make it as a comedian. His apartment gets robbed, there's rent due, all that stuff. At some point in the series, Jerry basically becomes bulletproof. He breaks up with a new woman every week, it never bothers him, and he is successful enough that nothing could possibly interfere with his livelihood. The series outright tells us this.
I just lost a job, and 5 minutes later, get another job, same weekend, same money.
You know who you are? Even Steven.
The coffee shop in the first season has warm colors, a warm glow. The coffee shop in later seasons is too brightly lit. In seasons 1 and 2, the camera moves around from time to time. This may seem like a small thing, but it adds to that 70s New York movie cinematic quality. By season 3, everything is uniform, cookie cutter, leveled. I prefer the Seinfeld logo in seasons 1 and 2 as well. It's just Seinfeld. But by season 3, it's Seinfeld. Where am I going with this? Well, the more Seinfeld goes on, the more it looks and feels like an ordinary sitcom. What set it apart in seasons 1 and 2 is largely gone by season 3. It retains some of the conversational tone of seasons 1 and 2, but even that is given a heightened reality to it. The first conversations in Seinfeld are obviously in the pilot, and they are between Jerry and George. They debate Jerry's chances with a woman and have a back and forth about this throughout the episode. By the second half of the series, everyone and everything has a wacky nickname. The Close Talker, the Two-Face, the Soup Nazi.
Soup Nazi? You people have a little pet name for everybody.
Worse than that, the characters change in uncomfortable ways and become less relatable. The writers had a mandate: no hugging, no learning. This was one way that Seinfeld could differentiate itself from other sitcoms. I'm all for it in theory, but at some point, the writers took that to mean that the characters could only change for the worse. Jerry, in seasons 1 and 2, was generous, friendly, mostly kind to women. Elaine was a warm, caring person who stood up for her principles. George was still George, but he had more moments of empathy in the first half of the series than in the second. Season 1 George would never experience restrained jubilation over the tragic death of his fiancée. He would probably cry and feel guilty about any sense of relief he felt. Let's be clear, sitcoms don't have to be realistic to be good. In fact, they traditionally are not realistic. I know that, but that's what set Seinfeld apart at first. Seinfeld was, in seasons 1 and 2, a sitcom that defied sitcom standards. It was novel, unique, and then it just wasn't. It still had its own style and its own flavor and its own qualities, but it wasn't Seinfeld with block letters anymore. Let me give you some examples here. In season 8, Elaine travels to Myanmar and plays out an Apocalypse Now homage. In season 9, Kramer somehow stumbles upon the original set of The Merv Griffin Show and begins hosting a mock talk show in his apartment. This is what Seinfeld was, and this is what Seinfeld became. It's possible that the changes were simply necessary to keep the series on the air. I sometimes wonder what Seinfeld would have been like if it retained the season 1 and season 2 aesthetic and characterizations. Would it have been a better show? A worse show? Simply a different show? Or would it have just gotten canceled in season 4 or 5? It's impossible to see that alternate timeline and know for certain, but it's something I wonder about and something I wish I could have seen. I'm probably not the only one. Seinfeld had a strange, divisive series finale. The finale was fitting. 4 people who usually don't mean any serious harm, but seldom put their necks out for anyone, are tried and convicted for neutrality in the face of a crime. The Good Samaritan law, as described in the series finale, states that bystanders must help if it is reasonable to do so. Who decides if it's reasonable? Is it reasonable for a stranger to help their neighbor? Yes. Is it reasonable for a stranger to approach an armed criminal? Maybe not. The criminal is clearly indicating that he has a gun. The victim shouts, "Don't shoot." Is it really a good thing to escalate this matter and potentially turn it into a shooting? What is the best thing to do here? Probably not make fun of him because that's what they did, but that in and of itself is not a crime. It's just kind of crummy. For New Yorkers, this was just Tuesday. They didn't react the way he did because their environments are different. Also, what gives? As the carjacker is driving away, a police officer shows up and speaks to the victim, but the police officer, instead of getting in his patrol car and chasing after the carjacker, arrests Jerry, George, Kramer, and Elaine. Seriously, watch how close the police officer is to the action and does nothing. The car is right there. Just go after him. Oh, I get it. You're going to arrest 4 witnesses who had nothing to do with it because it's easier than chasing the actual criminal. Fuck the police, am I right, people? Hello, everyone. This video is much longer than my usual thing, and it took months to make. If you are interested in rewarding my efforts, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/Renegade Cut, or you can just click like and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you soon.